Open up to the book of Acts. If you know the Bible, there's usually Bibles in the... They're not pews, are they? And the chairs, and the carpeted chairs around you. You might remember last week we got about halfway through chapter 16. We're going to finish the rest of that this morning. And so, just to kind of recap what happened last week. If you remember, Paul and his companions, they're on one of their several missionary journeys. They're hopping along. They know where they want to go. And 2 times it says the Spirit of God thwarts them from going a particular direction. They want to go to Asia, the Spirit of God thwarts them from going. It doesn't say how, just stops them from going. They want to go to Bithynia, the Spirit says, no, we're not going there either. And they get redirected to Troas along the coast, and eventually to the port of Neapolis. We saw that in the video. And then on to the ancient city of Philippi. And when they get there, they meet a group of ladies. They go outside the city gate. They go down to the river. As we saw in the video, it's more of a kind of a creek. It's no more than 10, 12 feet across. And there's a group of ladies there. And Paul and Silas and the companions meet them. And there's a particular gal there. Her name is Lydia. She's probably not divorced. She's probably widowed, but one of the two. She's a very, very strong businesswoman from Thyatira. She's in a very, very heady kind of economic trade of purple dye, which is what Thyatira was known from. She ends up listening to Paul and his companions, hear about Jesus and the story of God. She ends up giving her life to Jesus. They go back to her house. Her whole family gives their lives to Jesus. And so it's great. Paul's got the first convert in all of Europe. And so Paul hangs out, and every day they're just kind of going to and fro, maybe back to the river to pray, and then through the agora, and they're just doing their business. And as they're going, this girl, this woman, who's described in the text as having a spirit of divination. Literally the translation is she has the spirit of the python on her. She's a prophetess from Delphi, also known as a Pythia. And we did the whole story last week. If you didn't hear it, you can go online and watch the video and listen. But Billy, she's got a demonic spirit. She's a prophetess. And every day she's just following Paul back and forth, and she's just yammering. And Paul just gets so fed up with that, he can't take it anymore. Why it took this many days to bother him, I don't know. And he tells the spirit to get the heck out of her and go away. The spirit leaves. The girl's freed from this demonic thing. Her master is upset because now he's lost his income. Because she answers questions for people and he takes the money for the answer. And so he gets upset. So he stirs up Cain in town. Says that this group of people, Paul and Silas and their companions, excuse me, are basically lousy people for the Romans. And what Paul gets from this is he gets arrested, he gets beaten with a bunch of rods, he gets bound, he gets thrown into jail. And what's really fascinating, and we're gonna hit this point a bunch of times throughout this process. Polly, I hope you're getting me a glass of water.
I am.
Oh, why I don't just bring one up? I guess I just love being served. I am, and I shouldn't do that. Because you're the faithful people in the church that showed up at church. Those are the sinners that are not here. One of the thoughts, thank you so much, that I want to kind of camp on, and we talk about this a lot. I talk about this a lot. It's a particular sore point of mine in life. Oh, man. What's fascinating to me about Paul, and you see it particularly in this chapter, is that he's not a victim. He's not a victim in any way. There's no self-pity. You don't read any of that in this chapter. You don't see Paul, for example, in this saying, God, why did you do this to me? Or God, how could you have allowed this to happen? All of us could easily go there and do very often, don't we? When things go south, the immediate thing is, man, God, have you not noticed the things I've been doing for you? I can't believe you didn't make this thing work a little better. Could you not have greased my wheel a little bit so it turned a little more smoothly? What Paul does instead is he first of all assumes there's another force at work in life. See, when Paul sees something goes south like that, his assumption is that there's more than God involved, that God has an archenemy in Satan, and that God is constantly attempting to be thwarted by this archenemy. Paul also assumes that God is still there in the midst of this happening, and that God will somehow reach into this chaos that the enemy is creating and create something on behalf of the kingdom. And Paul sees these things, because of all that, as a mere blip compared to everything else God has piled on him from a blessing standpoint. Isn't that fascinating? Paul gets beaten with rods, arrested without a trial, thrown in jail, and for him, it's just a kind of a mere dot compared to this pile of love God has received. We see this kind of attitude. Later on, Paul writes a letter to this little bitty church in Philippi, and in chapter 1, this is what he says. Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances, I love that, that's not a victim comment, have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Messiah has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. And that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my circumstance, my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Look at verse 24 in our passage in chapter 16 of Acts. Actually, we'll start in verse 23. When they had struck them with many blows, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And the jailer, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison. That's the place where the most notorious crimes were committed, by the way. That's where you threw them. It's also where you threw the people of the lowest part of society, in particular where you would throw a non-Roman citizen. And they fastened their feet in stocks, which is a further indignity. Verse 25. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying. The text doesn't say what they were praying for, but we can kind of guess. They might be praying for their release, for their safety. More than likely, because we know Paul and Silas and these guys are not victims, and they're not full of self-pity, and they're not full of their own ego and their own bruising. What they're probably praying for is Lydia and her family, who have just given their lives to Jesus, who no longer now have these strong believers around them to mentor them, to teach them, and to encourage them, praying for their safety, praying for their encouragement. And they were singing hymns of praise to God. Again, this is so contrary. They're not yammering. You know what I mean by yammering, right? You know the internal chatter you have when life goes south and you think you've gotten an unfair deal? And by the way, you might have. There's no yammering in Paul whatsoever. Instead, he has this sense still that God is still God, and that he is somehow still deeply, deeply blessed by God. And they acknowledge that in the midst of this God that's still God, who has blessed them, is still going to be there for them and stick with them. And lo and behold, look what happens. And the prisoners, it says, were listening to them. I love this. That somehow their lives look so different, their perspectives are so different that everybody else goes, wow, that is not normal. Verse 26. And suddenly, I love that word, coincidence? I think not. There came a great earthquake, so that the foundation of the prison house were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. And when the jailer awoke, and saw the prison doors opened, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Don't harm yourself, for we are all here." This is a strange deal, right? So there's an earthquake that hits. It's not so heavy that it knocks the whole thing down, but it's heavy enough and selective enough that latches come undone, which you can imagine. By the way, earthquakes all over this region, particularly in Greece and Macedonia, were extremely common. And when they had an earthquake, very unlike our society now, we're such a scientific society, they assumed there was a God behind it. So they're already thinking that way. when this happens. And we can't tell what happens because Luke doesn't tell us. Either there wasn't time to escape, I think that's less likely, or more than likely, Paul gets the other folks to not run out of the jail and to stay there because he's got so much presence of mind. And again, to Paul, this is not some coincidence. Luke's word of suddenly is a kind of a funny coincidence word. To Paul, this is not a coincidence, and I don't think to Luke either. So see, to Paul, there's no happenstance in life. To Paul, there's no, I would say it this way, randomness. There's no disconnected dots in life. And notice what Paul's perspective produces. He has such an elevated perspective. And what I mean by that, Paul is outside his own noodle. Paul is outside this yammering shell we're in that constantly tells ourselves that we're getting a raw deal and we should feel sorry for ourselves and everybody else is wrecking our life. He's above that in his perspective. And that looks so odd, which is really sad, but it's so unique and looks so odd. He's actually concerned about the guard in the middle of this whole thing. I think that, to me, is just uncanny. This guy is faithfully giving his life to God. He wants to go one direction. 2 times, the Spirit of God makes him go a different direction, 200 miles out of the way he wants to go. And what Paul gets for this little door prize for following God is a nice Roman beating, an arrest without a trial, shackles thrown into the inner part of the prison. And somehow, this guy, rather than feeling sorry for himself, has clarity. And I think he has clarity because, again, it's a pretty simple thought process for Paul. First of all, he assumes God has an active enemy. That sounds like an obvious answer, but we don't think like this. I hear this so often in Christian communities. Some nasty thing will happen to somebody, and then you'll see an interview, and the answer is, God's got a perfect plan. And I'm sitting there thinking, so does Satan. But that's never mentioned. As if God somehow is just breaking arms and, splitting marriages up, right? And taking people's lives. I mean, this is not what you see in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Anything you wouldn't see in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is not God. And Paul has this rudimentary assumption. There's an enemy involved, and so not only is he constantly seeing God, but he's looking for that enemy and separating it out from God. And then he assumes in the middle of that God will not abandon him. So he's not mad at God when life turns. He's upset that there's an enemy that wreaks this much havoc, but he knows in his soul that God is still next to him. And here's the kicker. He knows because he knows the story. He's read it so many times, which is why we dedicate ourselves to this so much in this church. He assumes that God specializes in stepping into these moments of chaotic mess and darkness and raising life out of it. And he is so full, so wide-eyed, so full of perspective that instead of being worried about himself, he is first and foremost concerned that this guard is okay. Look at verse 29. And he called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. And after he had brought them out, he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, you and your household." Again, how bizarre is this? What does your life have to look like that somebody watches your life and sees how different your reaction to life is and says, whatever you have, I've got to have that. I don't even know what it is, but I need it. Have you ever had somebody ask this question or seen them watch somebody else maybe because their life doesn't reflect this? This is powerful stuff. This is otherworldly. This to me is like scenes we read all over the scriptures. This is a big storm and the disciples freaking out. Jesus sound asleep in the boat. Right? This is This is Stephen gets killed. Peter gets arrested, so he's going down next. He's in jail waiting for them to kill him next. And he's in the jail just sound asleep, snoring away. Paul has that kind of restfulness about him. He has that kind of just joy and assurance and outlook, if you will. Paul has this heart that is then more moved by someone else's situation than his own. And it's all because he senses the presence of God. He has the Spirit of Jesus with him. He knows God's with him. He knows the enemy's fighting against God. And he's a bit player in this whole thing. And he knows he has a great seat to watch this take place, even though it's painful. And again, this is a really important comment. This is not something you do. This is not something, folks, you try and exercise out of you. This is something you sense. This is something you feel. This is something you experience. Paul is not just making himself have perspective. That won't work, right? We all know that won't work. You can't fool yourself. This is a belief that runs so deep into his inner fiber, into his soul, that it has literally elevated him up to a place above the concern for himself, where he now has God's view, and his view is then, wow, I hope this jailer's okay. Just phenomenal. Verse 32. And they spoke the word of the Lord with him together, and all who were in his house. And he took them that very hour of the night and washed their wounds, and immediately this guy was baptized, he and all his household. And he brought them into his house and set food before them and rejoiced greatly, having believed in God with his entire household. The oppressor is now blessing the oppressed. Again, this is what Christianity looks like. This guy is just so simply overwhelmed with gratitude now with God. Now his heart is overflowing. Now he's above his own noodle, if you will, seeing the needs of these guys. Verse 35. Now when day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, "Release these men." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore come out, and now go in peace." This is hilarious, by the way. I love the picture we have of these magistrates who have no perspective, who are not elevated out of their own noodle, by the way, and they actually think they're controlling this whole thing. So when we're reading the story, we're reading it from God's perspective, and we're reading it from a perspective of elevation like Paul, and we're seeing God just weaving a tapestry while Satan is trying to tear it apart. These guys are lost in their own mire and think that they're actually pulling the strings. It's absolute insanity. And the presumption here, by the way, is that this guard is so brash, in the middle of the night, took these guys out of the jail, walked them home. This is relaxed, by the way. Washed them, cleaned them up, made them a nice meal, enjoyed a good family time, and then said, "Well, it's about 6:30 in the morning. We better sneak back into jail." This is hilarious. Look at the difference. These magistrates look at this and say, "We're pulling all the strings," and have no perspective. The jailer, who really could get killed for this, is so relaxed, so above all this. All he can see is these guys need, and he's just going in, coming out, complete relaxation. Verse 37. But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are sending us away in secret? I think not. But let them come themselves and bring us out." Again, listen to the vitality in his voice. This is not a man of weakness. This is a man who senses God, knows God is running the show, knows even in Satan's greatest strikes, God absolutely will win out, and he's so relaxed in this, he's just got this deep, deep conviction inside. And by the way, this is not the sound of a bitter guy. This is not the sound of a revengeful guy. This is not the sound of a tense guy. This is the strength that's in a guy, and you can see how strong his voice is in this. For the second time, Paul is faced with freedom, and he refuses it, by the way, in our story in Acts. And he has a point to make about this Roman citizenship, and this is something to camp on just for a couple of minutes. He should have been treated fairly under Roman law. He should have been given a trial, but instead they race right to beating him with rods as a non-Roman citizen, and yet he is a Roman citizen. And it wasn't a habit of Paul's to insist on his rights. And we already know from this passage you can feel from Paul is not about I'm not getting a fair shake, right? This is a no victim passage. This is a no self-pity passage. So we know what Paul is not doing already is demanding rights for himself. We already know that because it's not what he's like. So we do have to ask the question, why is Paul demanding this? And I think there's probably many reasons. There's at least a couple that I can think of. First of all, if Paul can be treated this poorly, so can somebody else. And Paul is going to put a stop to this kind of treatment of somebody before they actually find out the facts. Paul is actually doing this for the next person that comes along. Isn't that fascinating? I also think, and I know this to be the case with Paul, his reputation matters a ton in his ability to travel and share the gospel. There are actually 4 examples like this between chapters 16 and 19 where Paul's reputation is on the line. And Paul is caught between a couple of very suspicious communities, and Paul has to walk both lines very carefully. I mean, God is the one kind of supernaturally leading him and telling him what to say and doing all this, but he also expects Paul to use his brain. And so Paul wants to walk these multiple lines in a way that the gospel doesn't get inhibited because he makes dumb decisions. For the Jewish people, it's very important that Paul walk uprightly, that he follow the Torah. This is why, for example, he has Timothy, after he gets saved, who's a Jewish guy and circumcised, gets circumcised. He doesn't want to take an uncircumcised Jewish Jesus follower around with him, and other Jews say, you no longer think the words of Moses are important. So Paul is going to walk the Jewish line very carefully. But he's also going to walk the Gentile line carefully. This Roman citizenship that Paul has is a coveted thing in the Roman Empire. And Paul does not treat this lightly. This is his ability to roam around the Roman Empire anywhere the Spirit leads. So again, this isn't about Paul demanding some satisfaction about his life. This isn't about, I didn't get a fair shake and I'm going to square this up. For Paul, that's God's problem. For Paul, he simply wants to fight on behalf of other people. He simply wants to position himself so that the gospel is not hindered in any way because of his own particular actions. And he's concerned about how that gospel advances. He may even have a reason of wanting these magistrates to get a chance to come to him and have a conversation so that they see themselves more lightly. And just a side note, there's some uncertainty as to how Paul would prove his Roman citizenship. If you claim to be a Roman citizen and it turned out to be false or you couldn't prove it, you die. That's how this went. So this is a serious thing Paul is raising. So he has to have some definitive way to prove this. It's very clear from the scriptures. Paul's a Jew also. He is not wearing a Roman toga. The Jews would never have accepted him. So he's a Jewish person. It's legal to be Jewish in Rome. More than likely, most scholars believe that what Paul is carrying is what all Roman citizens carry, which is a Roman diploma or a diptych. It's actually these kind of 2 paddles, if you will, with writing on your registration and your birth or your citizenship, and they were attached by a hinge. They found tons of these in archaeology. So more than likely, Paul has this in his hip pocket, just ready to draw it. It would be morale. Verse 38. The policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates. They were afraid, I think that's light, when they heard that they were Romans, and they came and appealed to them. Notice what it looks like when you're not elevated. They're just completely at the whim of every wind of change in life. Right? Paul proves to them he's a citizen, and now they free. They're all powerful when they think they have control. They find that they're not, they're freaking out. This looks a lot like our life, unfortunately. Up and down, and afraid and not afraid, tense and not tense. Not Paul. He's been raised above that because he has this deep sense there's an enemy. He has this deep sense that God is with him, and he has this deep sense God's going to win. But these guys do not look like that. And they came and appealed to them, and when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. Look at that just shriveled upness of these guys' perspective. They went out of the prison, and I love this, and entered the house of Lydia. So these guys are begging them to leave. Their answer is, we'll go kind of when we want to go. So they go back to Lydia's house, and when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them, and then they departed. So the final picture we get in Philippi is Paul and Silas in Lydia's house, loving them and teaching them from the scriptures as quickly and as deeply as they can so that they're fortified, so that their perspective is deep, teaching them that there's an enemy, teaching them that God will not leave them, and teaching them that God's specialty is stepping into the chaotic darkness of the archenemy and raising life out of it. Paul will actually get to return to this church. We'll see in chapter 20. He has a deep affection for these people. We see this again when he wrote this letter to the Philippians in chapter 1. I thank my God in my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all, in view of your participation in the gospel from the first day until now. He loves these people, and they love him. I want to close with a couple of thoughts that we've been really kind of hitting on a lot and hitting on this morning. And again, it's this idea of not being victims. I have been surrounded by this, and I've been this myself. This is not the perspective of somebody that knows God. It shouldn't. It's unbecoming of us, if you will. It's this idea of self-pity, where it's so important to us to have our life treated properly that we miss everything else God is doing. So many of us, with life kind of turns south, we first of all get really upset with God because God hasn't treated us properly, or we get upset with everybody else because they're on tap for making my life work. You ever do this? You ever go home and you're already in a foul mood, or somebody does a trigger, and you get to this point where you say, I'm in a bad mood now. You're not making my life work. This is a victim mentality. This is not what we see in Paul. And the second thing is you fail to see then God's ability to step into everything. And this works. Well, let me add the second point, and I want to talk about kind of how this comes out. The second thing that is so deeply attached to this is when we're not victims, when we're not in a self-pity mode, and we're constantly thinking, enemy, God's presence with me, God redeemed me. Those three thoughts. When we're constantly elevated in that moment, we're in the moment, then suddenly life is not disconnected. The greatest thing that we can glean from, in my opinion, my lousy, humble opinion, the greatest thing that we can glean from this study in Acts that we're looking at for, 9-10 months, is this point. That the Spirit of God is constantly working in and through and around us. And that it's not randomness. So that we train our eyes and our ears, we train our soul, our very soul, to have eyes to see and ears to hear God moving. That we wake up, we go about our day, and we're waiting and watching. And we see the glass fall off and break in some way, and we say, okay, I've seen this before. I've seen darkness in this world. Now, God, what will you do with this? And we should look for this in big ways, and we should look for this in little ways. Craig Briscoe, who's just got crazy perspective. He's out mountain biking, what was it, 3 months ago? Crashes his bike, he's a fireman by the way, breaks his wrist, next thing you know he's got a plate in there and screws and I don't know, wires and maybe a motor, I don't know what's in there at this point. He's been out of work and you know, I left him a message because you know, especially for a man, when you can't work, when you can't, it can get to you. And he just had this steady perspective. Well, the poor guy, the family goes down, you know, I was making fun of the rednecks over there. They go down into the desert in the Mojave, you know, 8-10 trailers, and they got the whole park set up, and they're motorcycling. Not Craig. Craig goes down there, he can't motorcycle. Never for a moment. We went to lunch Tuesday at our regular lunch. We had 7 guys around the table, and it was so cool to listen to it because none of it was like, from Craig, was like, God, I missed that ride, I didn't get to go do this. You know, it's just the little boy stuff that I just loathe in myself, right? What it was he said, God gave me these opportunities. I was in camp all week. And so I couldn't really go anywhere. And I ended up having some amazing conversations. He said to me over lunch, everybody else, we have these, you know, without 7 people, you can't have one big conversation that beats brass rails. So there's probably 3 conversations going on. He said to me, it's like I break my wrist and God says, I can work with this. I can work with this. Isn't that cool? God didn't shove him off his mountain bike and go, oh, this will be fun. I'll break his wrist so I can advance the kingdom. I think, first of all, God's a little nicer than that. You wouldn't see that in Genesis 1 and 2. God doesn't need to do that. He's a little bigger than that. By the way, he doesn't even need any of us to advance the kingdom, just so you're aware. It's Jesus' comment. Don't worry, you can quiet them down, but the stones are going to start singing if they don't, so take your choice. God's completely capable on his own. What he's doing is he's blessing us in the moment. So the bike goes over, the wrist breaks, and God says, it may look like, say, he's trying to disconnect the dots. I will make a stream of pearls together from this. And that's exactly what took place. There were guys around the table that just, one by one, there were these little words that would come out there. Craig, that is awesome. You're a stud. Way to keep your mind on God. It just kind of went around the table. You know, this is what Paul's like. I've told you the story, by the way. That's in the little ways, the big ways. Remember I told you, if you remember, if you were here, my brother, who's the CEO of the YMCA, he came and spoke. Remember, gave a sermon in May or June, if you're from this church. And then the next week, his chaplain came. And if you recall, his chaplain, Eric Reese, his daughter, his 12-year-old daughter, got cancer. In the midst of getting cancer, God kind of gave her an idea. She started these things called joy jars, and they're little jars full of all these goodies for dying cancer kids. And they've given tens of thousands away since she's passed away, by the way. It's gotten so big that it's like uncontrollable. Well, what happens is, he speaks, I find all about the joy jars. I go back, I jump over the fence, I go to my back neighbor that I've never met. For those of you that don't know the story, I'm seeing if I can fix my drainage. I don't know how this took place. I saw something on her camera. I was asking about it because I was looking for non-randomness and having this conversation with her and just really like these people. Next thing I know, I don't know how it came out, but I mentioned Eric Reese's name. She acted like it was Elvis. I mean, honestly, he's like a rock star. Well, I said, I can introduce you. She's trying to start a nonprofit with another gal. They want to make capes for kids that, like autistic kids, some cancer kids, because they don't like to wear clothing. So they put capes on them, and suddenly the rest of the clothes. Your daughter wears that cape all the time. Is that part of it, or is she just like to be a princess? Okay, just checking. But she'll do anything with that cape. She's had that for weeks. I hope you're washing it every now and then. Okay, so it look like walk out of here on its own. So anyway, so I hook up with Eric Reese. Next thing you know, coincidence I think not, 100 capes get made. They get shipped down and sent to Eric Reese, and they get stuffed into joy jars. And next thing I know, I get a picture of these kids with cancer wearing these capes for Harris. By the way, they're not believers that are making these capes. Next thing I know, I'm in a coffee shop in Alamo with her and her friend who also doesn't know Jesus, whose life is falling apart, and she knows that I'm a pastor, and could I bring some perspective to it, right? Now, Of course, the story doesn't end because my sister-in-law, my CEO brother's wife, she just got her decorating license, and they're starting a business, she and her partner, and she finds out that Eric is giving these joy jars, of course, and these kids are struggling and dying of cancer, they're trying to make it, and they want to find a way to do this, so God taps them on the heart, and the next thing you know, they take their decorating skills and they want to go to these cancer patients' homes and change their roof. Watch this video real quick if you got that available.
We're doing a little room makeover for Katie Holly. So today we're going to be demoing out this tile backsplash and the little tiles surrounding the shower area. And then we're going to repaint the room, hang some different fixtures, and be done.
I think I'm gonna feel really happy. I'm probably gonna cry.
We got her some cool furniture. We got her like an acrylic chair to go with a brand new desk that's white and really clean. We also got her all wonderful new bedding. And then in the bathroom, we are using some very cool tile to accent her modern look.
I'm doing this because we wanted to find out some worthwhile charity work. Just trying to get back.
Unfortunately, Katie is going through what she's going through, but little things like this really do make a difference in people's lives. So, yeah, that's the main reason why we're here today, and hopefully bring some light and a smile to her face tomorrow.
This is a little dragonfly that was actually stenciled on her wall, and we hope she loves her room.
Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh!
Wow!
Oh, I love it! Oh my gosh, and this show.
It's all your idea.
Oh my gosh, yeah, look at the bathroom.
Oh!
Oh.
Oh, now I see what you were saying.
Thank you so much. My room is perfect. It's just absolutely beautiful. It's so happy. Like the color, the beautiful sheets, the chair, and just the whole room just makes me, I think, want to keep going. So I just need to come home to heaven. I'm eager. Do you?
I have nothing more to add to that. Father, I'm reminded of that line at the end of the movie, The Book Thief, where he says, in one moment, I've seen the worst of life, and the best. This place can be so dark, so broken, so mean, so nasty. We thank you. In a weird way, you have nothing to do with it. From the cause, Father. But while Satan tries to break the string of shells apart, you weave a pearl necklace out. So, Father, may we as your church, your bride, may we live differently. May we feel and sense differently. May we have a perspective of the truth. And may we have eyes to see and ears to hear. So watch you redeem a broken world. And give us the privilege of having the best seat in the house. We pray these things in your Son's name.
Amen.